This week, we're into week two of 5 in this accelerated course cycle, examining science fiction, future shock science fiction film. And film just gives us a kind of focused way to think about a genre. It doesn't mean future shock is limited to film. And in fact, it's not. There's some excellent TV programs that delve into this content. It's a genre, arguably, that was existing in literary form prior to even coming on the scene in film or television. So there's some keen works out there. And I love this idea of you all being these scouts, right? We're kind of having conversations and screening texts, and it's giving you some thought bursts, right? And then you can kind of go track down or explore and just learn about the genre. And while that's very conversational, and it's, in theory, fun, but it's helping us unlock some other critical thinking skills that then we just learn how to translate into different situations. So really quickly, on deck for week 2, because now we're starting week 2, just a little preview in Rick Altman's film genre, our theory book of the course. Our primary goal is looking at this question of how are genres used. Talked a little bit about Altman last week, and essentially Altman's interested in theorizing about genre. And what's exciting there is he's going to talk about it in terms of film genres, but he's going to talk about it as a method of marketing and advertising, and thus developing audiences, and the kinds of audiences that become like long-term investors. Think about something like the Marvel franchise, right? They wouldn't have 20 films with another 20 in development if they hadn't developed a fever pitch audience and market and to tap into it in a big way. And so, we could easily spin a course like this and say, what is it about these superhero formulas? Why are they so, ridiculously popular right now? Whereas if we looked back at film 75 years ago, we'd be saying the same thing about the American Western, something like that. And so Rick Altman is helping us develop an understanding for the various processes in which genres work to define entertainment, but also become defined by entertainment, by audiences. Meanwhile, I draw a little crown around Keith and Johnston's book, Science Fiction Film, Critical Introduction. A couple of just can't miss chapters. Love this book. Now, I'm enjoying it quite a bit. Talks about the origins of the sci-fi genre. I teased a little bit of origin of the genre last week, just talking about works like Fritz Lang's Metropolis and others. Really, there's something interesting. Someone Peter again brought up Mars Attacks earlier. And I was commenting on, before we set the recorder in motion, that I didn't understand that text all the way the first time I saw it. And what I mean is, I knew what was going on in the story itself. I could follow what was happening, alien invasion, these quirky little aliens, big brains, kind of a mean streak. But what I wasn't getting, and the reason it kind of failed as a box office draw, was it was reaching back. It was a callback to kind of B-movie history, to the sci-fi B-movies of the 1950s. And that's such a great connection for this film we're looking at this week, because it's those themes of the 1950s, early science fiction, that resonate and lead to where we end up with by the late 70s, throughout the 80s, right? This kind of modern take on the post-apocalyptic landscape and or Wasteland. And so let's rewind the clock and understand, how did we get there? And I think that cultural context is helpful. We have the 1950s. We've talked about the Cold War emerging. And this is a kind of post-war time where there's a lot of concern about nuclear capabilities, right? A potential nuclear war, but also we're launching satellites into space, and there's this kind of renewed interest in the stars and maybe what's up in the heavens. And so the 1950s give us this combination of UFO films and sort of nuclear parables, and things like Godzilla is a kind of traumatic way of working out the history of nuclear fallout in Japan. And it goes through its own genre phases too, right, within its own little monster movie cycle. But we have these films emerge that they're asking these kind of heady questions, but they're doing it on B budgets. And it's like this, once again, this fringe look at, it's a look at two fringe areas of culture, kind of that intellectual community, the scientific community, and also this sort of like idea of the B movie science fiction. We talked about last week, kicking this off, how the science fiction film was a latecomer to the popular imaginary. It wasn't the first or second or third film genre to really knock people's socks off. It had to build some steam. It needed to gain momentum. Often what we'll see is technology needs to advance. Technology itself, that is to say, special effects, right? Believability, like the transference of ideas into visual narrative needs to take place. And so we have innovators kind of changing things a little incrementally, decade after decade. And so when we get to the 70s, we talked about last week with Soylent Green, an energy crisis period. People are concerned. They're concerned about the environment now, starting to kind of consider things like weather change, diminished resources, right? A potential future with overpopulation and scarcity. And so this is feeding into the popular imaginary and becoming popular in smaller doses in film cycles. And we have an auteur emerge out of Australia, all right? And I say auteur, a kind of unique visionary filmmaker, George Miller, and he's going to craft a vision of a world that's falling into anarchy. And so 1979, we've just completed a kind of 2-decade run of the biker film B-movie genre. He makes the ultimate sort of end of the world biker movie, and it's Mad Max, 1979. And this film was shot under $400,000 and went on to make like $100 million globally. And we talk about like the finances and the economy, but also the kind of the cultural push for something, like something sparks interest all of a sudden. Point is, it was cheap. And so what does it mean to film something on the cheap? It takes a lot of guts usually to make something small look good on screen. And so some of his ideas were very jagged in their edges, but so was the narrative, so was the plot. And we have this civilization's kind of still going, but something's different, something's changed. And we don't really know what in the original Mad Max. And so Max is a kind of part of this police force, right? And he's part of, and they're lethal, but they also seem to be diminished in numbers. And he's going to encounter, as often occurs, certain tragic circumstances in that first film that reshape his identity and reshape the trajectory of his life. And so this movie, we can look at as a kind of, it's a hybrid. It's a hybrid of many things. And it's shot in the incredibly beautiful, but also bleak and borderline dystopic outskirts of Australia. So this kind of Australian outback countryside is a stand-in for a world where did everybody go? Like if last week we looked at overpopulation as a problem, Mad Max often pits a world in which population has dramatically decreased as a result of diminished resources. And thus, this is a question that Walking Dead explores too. What does it look like in that future world? Who are the survivors? And what is their psychology? And I think that's important to constantly process when you're watching a Mad Max film, is what kinds of people are occupying this type of world? What does it take to survive in this kind of world? And so that's a kind of through line from our Chuck Heston character Thorne last week. What kind of person does it take to survive? And so that's a theme we explore here. It's a potential theme we'll continue to examine. And so we're going to where that first film leaves, there is a second, and then tonight we're looking at the third in the series. But let me clarify. This is not a film that's like Star Wars or Avenger. Like, it's not moving in a direction where you've got to like keep up with, okay, this character's this and that plot line's crossing back over and here comes this film again. That's not what this film series is about. That's why we can just jump right into a third one. This film series is often referred to as an anthology, that they're kind of dropping us in to this very much mythological world. It's a mythological world where we see microscopic character change, and really Max is a prism for us to enter and explore and comprehend this world. And this protagonist is broken, right? From the first film, is broken. The second film was made with a bigger budget, but they even changed the name, The Road Warrior, for some of its release, to kind of mask the fact that it was a sequel that they were worried American audiences had never seen. Road Warrior is this huge hit. It's kind of it's an action road movie. And it starts to follow a mythological path, a kind of hero's journey path, right? This kind of arc of heroism and redemption. Well, this is one of the things that franchises used to do more than they probably do now, is the sequels would often just be a kind of retelling of the same story. Evil Dead movies did this, is the closest comparison that comes to mind. They're almost refashioning the movie again when they make the sequel with the bigger budget. This film is the most kind of Hollywood production looking and sounding. The other ones were very much kind of Australian, outback, desolate, lean and mean, and anarchic action picks. And this is much more like a mid-'80s action film. So you see you'll feel this more of like studio production, bigger budget, that sort of thing. And that works for it in some ways. And maybe it works against its original spirit of anarchy in other ways. It's gone on like decades later, 5 years ago, they did have a return. Mad Max, Fury Road. Nominated for 10 Oscars, by the way, should have won, arguably. An absolute reimagining of this world, true to the spirit, just amped up to like an 11. Maybe on a 4-point scale. That movie is a face melter. Highly recommend it. It's bananas. But this is what was seen as the third of like a trilogy capper, right? Because that was the whole thing for so long. So we're dealing with a kind of unexplained future where resources have diminished. Population also has diminished. It's a post-apocalyptic wasteland. And what does it mean to start over? And how does civilization rebuild itself? And what does that look like if we're rebuilding it with the only people that survived, right? Resources and scarcity, a through line, but played in different ways. Something to be watching, looking out for. Our Future Shock weekly themes, I'd argue, transient society. Now I'm drawing straight from the Future Shock book again. This is a theme Toffler talks about, that we've moved into a kind of transient society. I like to think of Mad Max as that, because these are people always on the road, on the move. Like it's just like Walking Dead. They have to pick up at any moment's notice. Every new season, right? They got to go to a new town or whatever, because things just, like the zombies hit the fan, right? And so be on the lookout for. I like this contrast. This is also borrowing from Toffler's work. Freedom, I added the air quotes, versus a loss of sense of belonging. They suggest that that's a sign of future shock, is we feel alienated. And then the death of permanence is another, again, I'm calling these theoretical tenets that we're drawing out of Toffler's Future Shock book. The death of permanence. What does that mean? And what does that do to our psychology, right? Our psychological condition of the worldview. Film focus, themes to look out for. I've prefaced this already. I think it's the master structure of this. They seem to be moving closer and closer to it with every entry. World building, and with this idea of mythology and mythologies. clearly cribbing, not unlike George Lucas with Star Wars, they're clearly cribbing from Joseph Campbell's work on specifically the hero's journey, A Hero with 1,000 Faces, and the hero's journey, this idea of departure, initiation, return, right? The hero can't just become the hero. They have to leave. They have to go somewhere. They have to journey. They have to encounter and overcome. They have to face obstacles. They're often aided by supernatural forces or special, science or technology or magic. And overcoming these obstacles, they descend into the abyss in mythological terms. And there it's just like Luke Skywalker going into the dark space on Dagobah, right? And what does it mean to look into that void? And what does it mean if you can come out of it or not? And they say when the hero can't return, then it's not it's not an epic, the story. It's a tragedy. Or what does it mean when the hero returns but is marked in some way? Mad Max is a marked and flawed hero. This is anti-hero. But by the third film, we're kind of seeing a little more of a romantic Hollywood type of plot. Here is something to look for, I think is pivotal in the second and third Mad Max films. Civilization, air quotes I'm adding again, like I'm, tongue in cheek, civilization versus wilderness. This is a theme that carries through from the American Western. I think it's prevalent in post-apocalyptic films. Oftentimes, post-apocalyptic films are very close in narrative structure to American Westerns. And salvation versus redemption or redemption, sort of what do characters go through? Can they find forgiveness? Can they forgive others? And this is how we get a bit of a hero's journey arc in our feature for week 2, special topics in media studies. Our future shock science fiction focus this week, Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome.